So like I said, my name is Maddie Kaufman, Program and Outreach Director at DFO, but also did my Master's of Science at UM in a coral restoration lab, so I have some knowledge level there as well. And before we jump into the impacts of marine debris on our coral reefs, we figured we'd start with a little background on what coral reefs actually are. So our coral reefs are these large contiguous structures of rock and limestone formations. You can find them offshore of coastal communities, offshore of oceanic islands, and they really form some of the most diverse habitats and ecosystems on the planet. Scientists often refer to them as the rainforests of the sea. And so how do they form? They are formed by these hard coral colonies. And so I emphasize hard here because on the coral reef, we have so many diverse organisms, and you have hard corals and soft corals, and they're closely related, but soft corals, like their name implies, are a little bit softer. They kind of blow in the currents of the ocean. You can think about sea fans and sea plumes, but these hard corals in this picture here are the ones that are really responsible for reef construction. And that's because these corals, as they grow outwards and upwards, they secrete a limestone calcium carbonate skeleton downwards. And so as they grow over time, and there's a bunch of them in a specific area, they accrete to form these coral reef structures. And that, again, it's that structure and accretion that's so important for habitat formation, for all these animals that depend on the reef, and for coastal protection. So to zoom in on what a coral actually is, if you zoom in really closely, these corals actually exist. Their individual organism unit is the coral polyp, and they exist in colonies of thousands to hundreds or hundreds of thousands of these polyps in a single colony. And they're all basically genetically identical, and they share resources among the colony. But when you zoom in, you have that individual polyp, and you kind of think of it as an upside down jellyfish almost. And you have these tentacles that come out of the skeleton, and they actually feed and pull food from the water column. And so that's why coral reefs or corals are actually technically animals. I didn't know that a while ago. It's a pretty, I say it's a confusing question because I like to, when I educate kids, I like to say that corals are actually three things. They're an animal because, like I said, they technically heterotrophically feed from the water column and get food and energy that way. But these corals also have an algal symbiont, a little unicellular algae that lives inside of its tissue. And they actually have like 1 million of these cells per square centimeter of tissue. And this algae depends on sunlight energy to photosynthesize, and then it actually translocates 90 to 99% of what it creates to the coral. And so it's a huge, huge energy resource for these coral species. And so they exist in a really tight symbiosis or a mutually beneficial relationship where the coral provides a home, the algae provides food, and there's really tight nutrient cycling between the two. So it's an animal, it's similar to a plant, and then it's also like a rock. Like I mentioned, it secretes that calcium carbonate skeleton and builds a rock-like structure. So why are our reefs important? This is a brief crash course. Our reefs are important for so many reasons, but one big one is coastal protection. Our coral reefs are our first line of defense when we have these big storm events. One study found that coral reefs can buffer up to like 97% of wave energy. So when we have these huge storm events coming in, it hits the reef first, and it buffers down that wave energy and protects us from other impacts that we would experience otherwise, or flooding impacts. And they also provide food for billions. So many species of fish depend on the reef at least one point in their life. And this food is so important for both coastal communities and landlocked communities. And I like to point out that this is becoming an even more important source of protein as people are switching away from meat in the interest of reducing climate change impacts. And since they provide food for billions, they provide economic opportunity through fisheries and commercial fishing, and it goes beyond that. They also provide economic opportunity through tourism and through recreation. A lot of people like you guys, since you're all snorkelers and divers, a lot of people visit Florida to go on these trips and to visit our coral reefs. And then another one that gets people's interest is pharmaceuticals, some compounds that scientists work into drugs that people use for certain ailments are found on Florida's coral reef. And then another crash course, why are reefs threatened? Again, this is just brief. I'd be happy to go into detail if you guys want to follow up. But the scientific community generally agrees that climate change is the #1 threat facing our coral reefs. And this is because of two things. One is ocean acidification. As we emit more carbon into the atmosphere, more carbon is absorbed by our ocean, and that leads to ocean acidification. And that process makes it more difficult for those corals to accrete that limestone skeleton. So it's harder for these corals to accrete and grow the reef. In extreme situations, it can even lead to degradation of that limestone skeleton. And the other factor is the increased temperatures of our waters. And that's because warmer temperatures actually disrupts that symbiosis between the coral and its algal host, or the algae and its coral host. And the corals actually expel the algae when the waters get too warm, and they lose that really important food source. So if it's a short period of warmth, the corals are able to recover, and some studies have found that they cover more resilient to future stress events, which is awesome. However, if it's prolonged and they lose that source of energy and food for a long period of time, it can result in coral mortality. Another one is water pollution. I'll go into the impacts of plastic pollution and actual hard debris on our reefs, but another point or type of pollution is nutrient pollution. So when we have runoff from coastal communities and from agriculture, it can introduce nutrients into our waters. And that nutrients allow for algal blooms and algal growth, because algae grows a lot faster than our corals. So when there's excess nutrients, the algae is able to bloom, and it can outcompete corals for space, and in extreme situations, even overgrow and smother coral colonies. Another big one is coastal development. As we populate our coastlines, it allows for more nutrient pollution and more human-induced pollution to enter our waterways. And there's also the direct impacts of sedimentation from development, when sediment flows out from certain projects and can smother our coral colonies. Finally, there's overfishing. A lot of communities can overfish herbivorous fish species. So that means these fish that feed on algae are being removed from our coral reefs. And so we don't have those fish removing that algae that I just described. And so again, it's able to grow a lot more and outcompete corals for space and potentially overgrow colonies. And before I go into the actual impacts of pollution on our coral reefs and coral colonies, I did want to touch on the relationship between plastics and single-use plastic pollution, which is really what DFO is, Reef Free Oceans, really tries to encourage people to avoid when we educate and go out and work with our communities. So single-use plastics, like 99% of plastics are actually made from fossil fuels, and they emit greenhouse gases throughout every stage of their life cycle. From plastic production, the actual extraction of oil and refining into the plastic products that we use, emits large amounts of greenhouse gases. And then at the end of the life cycle of a plastic product, no matter where it ends up, there are associated greenhouse gas emissions. From being incinerated, from being recycled, ending up in a landfill, all of these end of life locations are associated with greenhouse gas emissions. Even when plastics end up in the environment, they might be emitting greenhouse gases. There's new research out of Scripps that actually found when when plastics break apart under solar radiation in the lab in both freshwater and in saltwater, that process emits methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas emission. So just the use and production of single-use plastics and the disposal can contribute to coral bleaching. So now we'll go more so into plastic pollution in coral reefs, just to bring it back to give you guys a sense of the plastic pollution problem before going into details. This is our Milky Way galaxy. It's home to 400 billion stars, but right now there are 13 times more pieces of plastic in the ocean than stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And this is actually likely an underestimate, because this statistic was published in 2014. It was using data from the 2000s, and plastic production and plastic use has only increased. So we likely have even more plastic polluting our oceans. And is it affecting our reefs? Is it getting to the reefs? Because plastics can be pretty buoyant. However, certain plastics are actually negatively buoyant. And also when they're in the water column, they can kind of accumulate organisms that latch onto them and create a biofilm that also makes them negatively buoyant. And while there haven't really been too many studies about that I found about plastic pollution on Florida's coral reef, a 2018 study in the Asia Pacific found that there were estimated that there were 11.1 billion pieces of plastic entangled on coral reefs in the Asia Pacific region. So what does this mean? How does this impact our reefs? The same paper that quantified that density of plastics looked at disease. And so they went around and they did surveys of specific coral colonies, looked at whether or not they were in contact with plastic, and then looked at whether or not they had disease. And they found that the likelihood of disease increases from 4 to 89% when a coral is in contact with plastic. So this figure here, you can see in the left column A, that shows without plastic debris, the likelihood of disease on the x-axis is very low, without plastic debris, close to 0%. However, when in contact with plastic on the right B column, you can see it is much closer to higher levels of 75 to 100%. And it's not just these large pieces of plastic that might be causing problems. And so here I want to just quickly touch on microplastics. So plastics themselves, they do not biodegrade. And this is because they are made from oil and gas. They have these really tight carbon-carbon bonds. And since they're synthetic and man-made in the last like 150 years, right now, no microorganisms have evolved to break them down into carbon and hydrogen, or carbon and CO2 and water. And so they do not biodegrade, but they do photodegrade. And that's a process when sunlight, wave energy, wind energy causes these plastic products to break into tiny pieces of plastic. But again, that plastic never actually breaks apart. So you can think about it as they do not break down, but they do break apart. And we like to use a paperclip chain example to demonstrate this. You can have the polymer plastic as a paperclip chain, and it can break apart into the individual paper clips, but those paper clips themselves will not break apart. And again, while I haven't found studies looking at microplastic concentration in Florida yet, they have been detected in coral reef waters along the Great Barrier Reef. So there are microplastics in reef systems here in the world, not here in the United States yet. And so what does this mean? Studies are finding that corals can consume microplastics. And this is a really new emerging field with only like a couple dozen studies, but really interesting results so far. And studies in the laboratory have found that corals can consume microplastics at the same rate as their natural food sources. One study found that they actually preferentially consume microplastics over sand particles. And that suggests that they actually can use chemical signals or chemoreception to kind of taste and select for plastic. And another study found that they preferentially ate microplastics over natural brine shrimp. And so you can see that, or brine shrimp eggs. So this figure on the left is from that study. You can see it's the particles consumed on the y-axis and the type of particle on the x, and microplastics, that white box, is much higher than the actual brine shrimp eggs that they were fed. And so even though these were in the lab, there is a study looking at temperate coral species. So not here in the tropics, but further north. This is off the coast of Rhode Island. It's not a reef builder, but still coral species. And they sampled wild colonies up there and found microplastics within every single polyp that they ended up dissecting. So what does this mean? How is this impacting our corals? For one of the more obvious potential conclusions is that it impairs their food intake. These studies have found that the corals exposed to microplastics either did not consume their natural food sources afterwards or showed reduced consumption of their food afterwards. And a 2015 study that investigated this, when they dissected some of the polyps that were part of the experiment, they found microplastics lodged pretty deep within the gut cavity of the coral. And it led the researchers to conclude that these plastics can remain stuck there, and this could contribute to a starvation process because they might mistakenly think they're full and then stop feeding. And I know I said earlier that, you know, these corals live in the symbiosis and get so much energy from that algal symbiont. However, as bleaching events become more frequent, become more widespread, this heterotrophic feeding becomes more and more important. What else can microplastics contribute to? This was a newer study that was very, very interesting. I've sent out these slides afterwards if you guys want to check out the linked literature. So here, these scientists actually tagged an E. coli bacteria with green fluorescent protein. And then they got this biofilm to latch on to the microplastics that they were examining. And this is applicable to real world scenarios because microplastics in the environment have been shown to kind of act like sponges for toxins and absorb toxins more readily than natural sediments do. So they tagged the bacteria with green fluorescent protein, got it to latch onto the microplastics, and then fed these microplastics to the coral colonies. And they ingested them, and while they did find that after 24 hours, the corals egested or spit out the microplastics, 2 weeks later, when they followed up, they did find that the corals still had that green fluorescent tagged E. coli bacteria in their tissue. So in this figure, you can see in B and C, that's actually the coral that was fed that GFP, that green fluorescent protein tagged biofilm microplastic. And you can see it's still there. And in the bottom, that's the control where they weren't fed the tagged bacteria. And you don't see it fluorescing there. And this is really important because a lot of studies are showing that corals eat microplastics, but then they spit them out. So maybe it's not that big of a deal. But now we know that they could be retaining the toxins that might be on these microplastic particles. Few more things that microplastics might be doing to our coral colonies. This one study actually found that when these corals were exposed to waters with microplastics in them, they looked at gene expression and enzyme activity and kind of found upregulation in stress response and the downregulation or suppression of immune defense capabilities. So it could be hindering the coral's ability to have a properly functioning immune system. And then finally, this study is actually very new, published this year, and they looked at how microplastic exposure affected growth in coral colonies. They looked at Acropora cervicornis, the staghorn coral, and Pseudoploria clavosa. I cannot remember clavosa's common name. I'll get back to you. But these are corals here on Florida's coral reef. And so they looked at what this meant for growth. They looked at calcification, so that ability to secrete that skeleton. They looked at tissue area. And they also looked at buoyant weight, which is another way that scientists often use to measure growth. And they found that growth was negatively impacted in terms of calcification and tissue area for both species, and negatively impacted for buoyant weight for Acropora cervicornis. And so this image on the right shows the calcification results. The microplastic exposed corals are the black bars, and the control corals that were not exposed are the gray bars. And you can see that over time, that calcification declines more and more so for our corals exposed to microplastics.
We just had someone in the chat mention the common name is knobby brain coral.
Yes. Thank you. So most of my talk has been about microplastics because I'm kind of a little bit of a microplastic nerd, and it's a pretty new field of study. So I was having a lot of fun reading some of the new literature. But another really big category of debris impacting our coral reefs is abandoned fishing gear and abandoned fishing gear and trap debris. And this, a study in 2014 found that just surveying a bunch of reefs in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, which is a protected area. And they found that there were 85,000 plus ghost traps. So that means it's an old trap that's still intact, but is not marked by a buoy and is no longer in use. They found 85,000 of those, and they found 1 million plus trap remnants. So that's pieces of trap. That also includes trap that's somewhat put together and can still kind of trap organisms, but is not fully intact. So there's so much of this debris out there. And this is what we often find when we go out and do our scuba cleanups. And people are really like, oh, is it that bad if it's made from wood and natural materials? However, these materials can wreak havoc, not to be dramatic, on our coral reefs if they're left unattended. So we've got entanglement as a potential issue, and then smothering. So like I said, you know, that's a largely wood material. It's not unnatural. However, if these are left onto the reef, they can smother corals. When hurricanes come in, they can get tossed around the reef and damage corals. And then they can lead to abrasion in that process. So actually cutting the tissue, which is important because that opens the coral's tissue for invasion by pathogens and disease-causing organisms. And Jenna's definitely going to go into a little bit about the disease outbreak that's happening on the reef tract. So it's definitely important to remember, you know, we have this terrible disease outbreak. What could be causing it? You know, plastics could be contributing to the spread. I'm not sure, hasn't been studied. But then also this abrasion can also allow for a mechanism for invasion. So what can you do? On to the positive stuff. There's so much easy things we can do to help our reef, especially when it comes to marine debris and climate change. One, you can avoid plastics by switching to reusable bottles, reusable cutlery. That's kind of the first step. And as you continue, you can start supporting brands that reclaim ocean plastic and upcycle it in new materials. You can start advocating for a policy. There's a new Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act introduced to Congress. There are actually 2 bills related to plastics being reviewed by the Florida legislature right now. I won't go into that because I'm running out of time, but avoid plastics, reduce your greenhouse gas emissions to combat the climate crisis and avoid coral bleaching. You can do that by avoiding plastics like we talked about, but you can also do that by switching to a plant-based diet. Start with meatless Mondays. I haven't gotten there yet, but I've started. I know Rome wasn't built in a day. You just gotta kind of try tacking on these things incrementally. Scuba cleanups. You can come out on the reef and go diving with us and remove marine debris. We do these cleanups about maybe once a month or every other month. We do a 2-tank dive trip. We bring mesh bags and dive shears and gloves, and we remove marine debris from the reef. We'll then collect debris data and submit it to SEAFAN, which Jenna will go into, and where they can use it to make and inform policy decisions. And then you also can participate in coral reef restoration. At the University of Miami in the coral restoration lab that I did my master's in, they've been growing out and restoring corals for 10 years, but 5 years ago, they actually launched a citizen science program where any certified diver or any snorkeler can actually come out and participate in restoration activities where you visit the nursery, collect coral, and actually outplant coral fragments. So you should definitely follow Rescue Reef on social media and shoot them a message so that you can participate in that. And then finally, what else can you do? Incident reporting. When you go on these dives, you can report the marine debris that you see. You can also report other incidents through SEAFAN, which Jenna will talk about next. So yeah, hope this was informative. I'll answer any questions that you guys have. And we actually have a dive against debris coming up on Sunday that unfortunately is full at the moment, but if you want to potentially join, you can drop your email address in the chat. I can add you to the wait list and then add you to our email list so that you find out about future dives against debris. I went a little over how long I was gonna go. I'm sorry, I can talk a lot about this stuff. But
no problem. That was super interesting. Thank you. I hadn't had the chance to read some of those studies, so I learned something new as well. All right. So should we wait for questions about your presentation, or should I go ahead and start sharing mine?
Let's see. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to put, oh, hi, Kaleem. Feel free to put them in the chat. If questions come up later, we can answer them after Jenna's talk too. I don't think I see anything in Q&A yet. Yeah, I think you're good to start. And then if questions come up, we'll answer them after your presentation.
Sounds great. Okay, everyone can see my screen, right? Presentation, awesome. All right, well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for being here to learn more about the Southeast Florida Action Network, also known as SEAFAN. So as Maddie mentioned, my name is Jenna Dilworth, and I work for the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. and I have a bit of a mouthful of a title. I'm the Reef Resilience Coordinator in the Coral Reef Conservation Program, and I'm based in Miami, Florida. So one of my numerous responsibilities is overseeing our two citizen science programs, SEAFAN and Bleach Watch, and I'm going to be telling you more about both of those today. So here's just a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. So we're going to be discussing Florida's coral reef and its importance in Southeast Florida, some of which Maddie already covered. Then I'm going to go over the SEAFAN program and how it works. And finally, I'm going to talk about how you all can contribute to the program by submitting reports. And if you have any follow-up questions, I encourage you to email me anytime after the webinar. So I think Maddie has some poll questions ready to go for me, right? So before we get started, I just wanted to ask you all a little bit about yourselves. Or, sorry, what was our first question? I apologize.
No, it's okay. It's the what marine incident poll.
Okay, got it. Perfect. Okay, well then we'll start off by going into a little bit of overview of what is Florida's coral reef. So to start off, I wanted to share this video, and I am sharing sound, so hopefully you will all be able to hear it.
This is Florida's coral reef, a living kingdom, a refuge, and all of it a gift. We will protect its splendor and mystery. We will keep and preserve the gift we have received, our inheritance, our legacy.
Yeah, so I really love that PSA. I think it gives such a wonderful overview of how beautiful Florida's coral reef is. So Florida's coral reef extends from the dry Tortugas in the south all the way north to Martin County, and that's actually around 380 miles of reef. And it's actually the only barrier reef system in the continental United States. So what's really interesting about Florida's coral reef is that it's adjacent to one of the most densely populated and highly urbanized coastlines in the world. And we have so many people using the reef in Southeast Florida, and the reef is managed by various state and federal agencies, including DEP and also NOAA and the National Park System. So the Coral Reef Conservation Program, which is where I work, focuses on the northern third of the reef, which is the newly designated Southeast Florida Coral Reef Ecosystem Conservation Area, which is highlighted in this light blue color on the map. And so that begins just north of Biscayne National Park in Miami-Dade County and goes all the way up to Martin County. So Florida's coral reef truly is a national treasure. It's incredibly ecologically diverse with over 40 species of stony corals that provide habitat for millions of animals and plants. And every picture that you see here was actually taken on our coral reef here in Florida. So as Maddie mentioned during her presentation, coral reefs are economically essential as well. So as Maddie said, they're a first line of defense and protect the shoreline from waves during storms. Healthy reefs can break apart 97% of wave energy that would otherwise reach and erode our shores and beaches. They are also the main economic driver of coastal coral reef communities like the coral reefs. So they have aesthetic and recreational opportunities of snorkeling and scuba diving and a whole lot more. We also, of course, have our commercial and recreational fishing opportunities, especially here in Florida, where we're the fishing capital of the world. So in a recent study that was published, reefs here in Florida are valued at $8.5 billion and sustaining 71,000 jobs. But unfortunately, as Maddie mentioned, they're faced with both global and local stressors. So globally, we have climate change, which is increasing the frequency and severity of hurricanes, severe weather events, and extreme thermal events that can lead to coral bleaching, as well as ocean acidification, of course. And then in addition to those global stressors, there are also many local threats to Florida's coral reefs. So here, as I mentioned, in Southeast Florida, we live in the most densely populated and highly urbanized region of the state. And the reef is so close to shore in some areas that you can swim out to it from the beach. So that means whatever we do on land has the power to quickly and intensely impact the coral reef ecosystem. So since we have such a dense population in Florida, water quality is a huge stressor. And then additionally, fishing pressures, like Maddie mentioned, anchor and vessel damage, marine debris, and large coastal construction projects. But even though all of these issues are complex, they're issues that we as humans cause. So that means that we as humans also have the power to mitigate them. So one particular stressor I want to talk about is our ongoing coral disease outbreak. So we first received reports of a novel coral disease offshore of Miami in 2014. And this disease spreads across coral colonies and kills the tissue really rapidly. It affects nearly half of our stony or reef building corals. So we've called it stony coral tissue loss disease. And unfortunately, this outbreak has been really devastating. The types of corals that are being affected are the primary reef building corals in Florida. And some of those corals are now largely absent from many sites, particularly in Miami-Dade and Broward counties, which is where the disease outbreak first started. So since Florida's coral reef is economically and ecologically important, it's a really important issue for us to tackle. So just to give an overview of where this disease is present. So on the left, you can see a map from 2014, which shows where the outbreak first started, just north of Biscayne National Park. And on the right-hand side, you can see now in 2020 and now in 2021, the disease has spread throughout the entire Florida reef tract, all the way from Martin County to the Marquesas. And the only place that we don't have coral disease present in Florida is actually in the dry Tortugas. And unfortunately, there have also been reports of the disease in other Caribbean countries as well. So that's always a very doom and gloom section of the presentation. So I like to do a little bit of a summary of what we're doing about this disease. So the DEP is co-leading the response effort to stony coral tissue loss disease with FWC, NOAA, and also the National Park Service. And we're working with numerous partners from federal, state, and local governments, universities, NGOs, and most importantly, the South Florida community. So this is a really multifaceted response effort. We've established 10 different teams that are focused on different aspects of the response, like research, intervention, coral rescue, communication, data management, and also coral restoration, just to name a few. We've also started working with some other international partners in Mexico and throughout the Caribbean, because some of those places have also reported incidents of the disease. And the SEAFAN and Bleach Watch reports that we've been getting through our citizen engagement have been super important in understanding the spatial extent of the outbreak, as well as the different types of corals being affected. So we really rely on the community in our response. All right, so now that we know a little bit more about the pressures and stressors that are being faced by Florida's coral reef, I want to talk about SEAFAN. I've got another quick video to play for you all.
Florida's coral reef is home to over 40 species of living corals and millions of other plants and animals. Healthy reefs shelter our shorelines from erosion and coastal flooding. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection is asking for your help to protect this vulnerable treasure. Report reef damage, marine debris, invasive species, coral disease and bleaching to the Southeast Florida Action Network at SEAFAN.net. That's SEAFAN.net.
So that's a quick introduction to SEAFAN. So for some background, the DEP Coral Reef Conservation Program is responsible for managing that northern section of the Florida Reef, which is over 100 miles of reef, and we only have a staff of about 15 people. So it's impossible for us to know what's happening across the entire region. And so we rely on members of the community to let us know if they're observing anything unusual. So that's why we started this Southeast Florida Action Network, or SEAFAN program, to allow people to report those incidents to us so that we can then coordinate the appropriate response. Because we all want to contribute to keeping our reefs here in Southeast Florida as healthy, beautiful, and clean as possible. So using the SEAFAN reports, the Coral Reef Conservation Program can tackle three main goals. First, we can enhance marine debris cleanup efforts. Second, we can increase our response to vessel groundings and coral damage. And then we can also provide an early detection of potentially harmful biological disturbances. So SEAFAN covers the entire area of the coral ecosystem conservation area that I talked about earlier. So that includes Martin, Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade counties. So SEAFAN is meant to conduct reports of threats to the marine environment from the observers to the proper agency to coordinate the appropriate response. So those marine incidents can include algal blooms, anchor damage, marine debris, invasive species, and coral bleaching and disease. So let's look at some examples of marine incidents to see if you can identify them. So here is our first example of a marine incident.
Okay, so I just launched that poll, I believe, so you guys can
Yes.
answer the question if you can guess or identify what incident this is. All right, so far we've got all the votes for anchor damage.
Yes, and that is correct. So yeah, this is anchor damage in this photo. As you can see, it's completely broken apart the coral colony. So this can be super harmful on coral reefs, especially since so many coral colonies can take a really long time to grow. All right, and then this is our second marine incident.
Okay. One of the participants said they can't see the picture when I launch the poll, so I'll give everyone, sorry guys. I'll give everyone a second to view the picture and then I'll launch the poll.
Perfect.
All right. Is everybody ready? All right, launching the poll. While people answer that, I'll quickly answer a question in the Q&A box from Kirsten, if I'm saying that correctly. Have you found plastic in Florida that may not have originated in Florida, like plastic that has traveled from the Great Lakes? We've definitely found plastic here that has not originated here, but it normally actually comes from the Caribbean because we have the Gulf Stream that comes up and delivers a bunch of stuff from the south northwards to our coastlines. And so some examples of that are we found we can find these very specific vinagre bottles that actually come from the Dominican Republic. And we've also found little water packets that come from Haiti. So we definitely do receive some debris from the Caribbean and other parts of the world. So I'll end the poll and share results. Got some votes for coral disease and then majority for algae bloom.
Yes. So this photo is indeed showing an algal bloom. Specifically, this is an algae called Lingia, and blooms like this are a problem on our reefs because the algae like this compete for space on the reef with corals, and when they cover the corals, like in this photo, they can smother them. So who can contribute to SEAFAN? That's what we call our observer network, and that's you. Anyone who is out on the water for work or for fun can act as our eyes and ears on the reef. So different incidences that are reported to us by the observer network have different responders. So as the program coordinator, I take the incident reports from our observer network and I pass the report details along to the proper authority. So then we contact the citizen reporter afterwards if we need any follow-up information, or just to let you know, like, this is what we did with your report. So for example, just a few weeks ago, we received a report of a large coral colony in Broward County that had stony coral tissue loss disease, which is that disease that I talked about earlier. And we passed that report on to our partners at Nova Southeastern University, and they were able to send out a coral intervention strike team to locate, tag, and treat the colony. So you can see on this photo on the right-hand side, they were able to apply this special treatment to hopefully stop the disease from spreading on this particular colony. So stemming from SEAFAN, we have 3 separate programs that focus on specific incident types. And so we'll start by focusing on marine debris and the marine debris reporting and removal program. So we keep track of all of the reports of marine debris that come in through SEAFAN to identify specific hotspots where there seems to be more debris. And then we can target those areas during our marine debris cleanup events. So Maddie and Debris Free Oceans are really helpful with this because they'll report all of the debris that they collect at Debris Free Ocean scuba cleanups to SEAFAN, and then we know how much debris has been removed and where. And then if there's larger items that are reported, so for example, like an intact trap that Maddie was talking about, or like a large ghost net that individual divers aren't able to remove, we can also pass that on to our partners so that we can get professionals in to remove those items in the right way. And then the second program that we have focuses on vessel groundings and anchor damage, and that's the Reef Injury Prevention and Response Program, or RIPPER for short. So in Florida, we have the Coral Reef Protection Act, which protects our coral reefs and makes it illegal to anchor on or otherwise damage a coral reef. So that means if vessel groundings or anchor damage occur, we can open a case against the party that caused that damage and they will have to pay a fine. And then that fine helps us restore the damaged sections of the reef. Our RIPPER team acts like Coral Reef CSI. When we get a report of anchor damage or vessel grounding, they will go to investigate the scene to determine what level of damage occurred and what needs to be done to restore the reef. And then finally, in response to coral disease and bleaching, we also have our Bleach Watch program. So Bleach Watch is a special branch of SEAFAN. While anyone with no training can report events, including coral bleaching and coral disease to SEAFAN, to become a Bleach Watch observer, it's aimed at certified divers who undergo a specific training. And so we use SEAFAN Bleach Watch as an early warning system for coral bleaching and disease in Southeast Florida. So the goal of Bleach Watch is to provide an early warning alert for coral bleaching by monitoring climate and sea temperatures, involving the community in assessing the condition of coral reefs, and then combining all that information to produce current condition reports in the region. So that gets sent out to anyone who's interested, but also to resource managers who can use that information to help protect our reefs. So if you're interested in completing the Bleach Watch training and becoming an observer, you can go to seafan.net/bleachwatch and sign up for our mailing list. and be notified when we schedule our next training. So there's also opportunities for in-water and instructor trainings, but all of that's a little bit uncertain right now because of COVID-19, but definitely attend a virtual classroom training if you're interested. Okay, so now that you know all about the SEAFAN program, I want to go over the most important aspect, which is how you can submit a report. So if you go to SEAFAN.net, you will find our hotline number that you can call, or you can go directly to our online report form. And that's the preferred method for our citizen scientists to submit reports, just because that way we can make sure that we get all of the necessary information needed to coordinate the appropriate response. So I'm just going to go through what the process of submitting a report looks like with this online form. So we recently updated our report form, so it has this beautiful new look. And the first section is all about the site information. So this is where you'll input the information about where and when you observed the incident, as well as what type of incident it was. Date and time are really important, as well as the name of the site or a detailed description of what it is. And then knowing which county you observed the incident in helps us categorize where reports are coming from more easily. And then finally, we would really love to have GPS coordinates for the latitude and longitude of where you observed the event. That way we can tell our partners exactly where the problem is that they need to respond to. But if you don't have them from GPS, there's also a map where you can select your location from in the form. So the next section is all about the actual incident, and this is where you'll choose what type of incident you saw, whether it was marine debris or an invasive species or coral bleaching. So the example that we'll go through here is for marine debris. So it's going to ask you what type of marine debris you saw and roughly how much of it there was. And then it will also ask you if you were able to remove the debris, so we know if we have to make sure that someone goes out and removes it or if it's already gone. And then there will also always be a box for you to enter any additional information, any details that you think might be helpful for us as we're coordinating the response. And then finally, we'll also ask you some questions about yourself. And if you took any photos of the incident, you'll be able to upload them here. And we'll also ask you for your contact information, just so we can reach out to you to follow up if necessary and to let you know what action was taken as a result of your report. So if you're interested in learning anything more about any of the topics I just discussed, here's some really helpful links where you can find additional information on all of this. Florida's Coral Reef, the SEAFAN program in particular, the coral disease response, and then also some more information about our Bleach Watch training with our citizen support organization. And then here's my contact information. So again, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out. And yeah, I'll be happy to answer any questions in the few minutes that we have left.
Thank you, Jenna. That was great. I'm excited to pick up our scuba cleanups again and start getting more reports to you guys. We had a little COVID lull too, but getting back out there in smaller numbers.
Yes, and I just saw we got a question. Yes, I am. We're located in North Bay Village. We're right where the Pelican Bay marina is.
Oh, with like Pelican Harbor Seabird Station.
Yes. It's called the Biscayne Bay Environmental Center.
Right. And then she asked if you guys need volunteers.
So the volunteering situation is a little bit difficult right now because most of us at the office are still teleworking due to COVID. But if you would like to be contacted about volunteer opportunities as they arise again, you can send me an email and I'll keep you in our list.
Awesome. If you want to send her your email, Jenna, maybe if you want to put your email in the chat.
Put my email in the chat box just for anyone who didn't catch it from the slide.
Awesome. I'll put mine there too. And then she asked if you guys are going to do the April Earth Month program.
Yes, so we do have a whole set of exciting coral reef and related webinars coming up for Earth Month in April. And there will be some social media advertising as soon as we get the schedule completely worked out. Yes. And there will actually be a Bleach Watch class as part of the webinar week, or webinar month. So if you're interested in attending that and becoming a Bleach Watch observer, I will see you there.
And she asked when registration opens.
I don't think it's open just yet, but I believe we're going to be promoting on social media next week.
Awesome. And then Mackenzie asked, do you guys communicate with Reef when you guys get reports of lionfish?
Yes, we do. That's our partner on the lionfish front.
Thank you guys so much for coming. Definitely take down our emails if you have follow-up questions, and look out for a follow-up email from me in the future. And yeah, the recording will be on Facebook Live right when I turn off this going live, so you can check it out again ASAP.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Maddie, for having me as well. This was great.